Berlin, 1935. At night, the city looked disciplined rather than ominous. Streetlights burned with mechanical precision. Trams followed their schedules. Government buildings stood silent and orderly, their stone facades giving no hint of what was being planned behind closed doors. To an outside observer, this was a capital obsessed with efficiency, modernity, and control, the visible triumph of bureaucracy over chaos. But Germany in 1935 was not only preparing for war in factories and barracks. It was preparing for war in archives, ruins, and myths. On July 1, 1935, within the expanding power structure of the SS, a new institution was formally established, Ahnenerbe, the Study Society for Ancestral Heritage. Its name was deliberately vague, almost academic. It suggested libraries, lectures, careful research. Official documents described its purpose as the scientific study of German history, language, and ancient culture. In reality, Ahnenerbe was created to answer a far more dangerous question. What if Germany did not need to justify conquest? Because conquest was its ancestral right. The driving force behind this idea was Heinrich Himmler, Reichsführer SS, a man whose imagination was fixed not on the future, but on a distant, imagined past. Himmler distrusted Christianity, despised the rationalism of the Enlightenment, and viewed modern civilization as a thin crust covering a deeper, older truth. He believed that history had once belonged to a superior northern race, disciplined, ruthless, and powerful, and that this race had been betrayed by time, mixing, and moral weakness. To Himmler, the First World War was not merely a military defeat. It was a symptom of historical amnesia. Germany, he believed, had forgotten who it truly was. Ahnenerbe was designed to restore that memory. From the beginning, the Institute was not interested in asking open-ended questions. It was tasked with confirming conclusions that already existed. The Aryans were ancient. They were dominant. They were creators of civilization. Every excavation, every linguistic theory, every anthropological measurement was expected to point toward that single narrative. Evidence that contradicted it was not debated. It was ignored, reinterpreted, or quietly removed. This was not fringe mysticism operating on the margins of the Reich. Ahnenerbe was funded, protected, and expanded by the SS itself. Its members were not wandering occultists or self-taught prophets. They were trained archaeologists, historians, physicians, and linguists. Many held university positions. Many had published legitimate research before 1933. They wore civilian suits in lecture halls and SS uniforms in restricted meetings. Their work passed through offices, not temples. And that was precisely what made it dangerous. By 1937, Ahnenerbe had been fully integrated into the SS command structure. Its reports were classified. Its expeditions were granted military logistical support. Its researchers traveled across Germany and beyond, often with authority exceeding that of civilian academics. Knowledge became a weapon, not because it revealed truth, but because it shaped belief. The Institute's central premise was simple and devastating. If the German people could be shown to descend from an ancient, godlike civilization, then domination was not aggression. It was restoration. War was not a crime. It was correction. Prehistory became a battlefield. Stone tools were no longer artifacts. They were symbols of racial genius. Shared motifs across distant cultures were reframed as proof of ancient Aryan migration and supremacy. Ruins that did not fit the narrative were stripped of context or reattributed. The past, fragmented and incomplete by nature, offered endless space for projection, and Ahnenerbe filled that space with certainty. Himmler understood something crucial. Recent history was inconvenient. The Roman Empire contradicted racial myths. Medieval Europe was too Christian, too intermixed, too complex. Modern history exposed Germany's defeats. But deep antiquity, poorly documented, open to interpretation, could be molded into whatever shape ideology required. In that darkness, myth could masquerade as scholarship. Within SS circles, history was no longer linear. It was cyclical. Civilizations rose and fell, not through chance or economics, but through bloodlines. Degeneration was the great enemy. Mixing meant decline. Survival demanded purification, of culture, of memory, of people. Ahnenerbe existed to provide this worldview with footnotes. By the late 1930s, its ambitions expanded far beyond Germany. If ancient Aryans had once ruled the world, traces of their presence had to exist elsewhere. In Scandinavia, in Eastern Europe, in the Caucasus, in Central Asia. Expeditions were planned not to learn from other cultures, but to subordinate them historically. Every skull measured, every legend recorded, every site excavated was filtered through the same assumption. Germanic ancestry stood at the origin of civilization itself. The implications were profound. If destiny was inherited, then resistance was meaningless. If history had already chosen its rulers, then morality was irrelevant. If the past granted permission, then the future had no right to object. This logic did not yet produce mass graves in 1935. It produced paperwork, budgets, research proposals, quiet conversations in offices lined with maps and artifacts. It produced men who believed they were restoring order to history, not preparing the ground for murder. But the transformation had already begun. Once knowledge ceased to be a search for truth and became a search for validation, violence followed naturally. A myth, once institutionalized, no longer needed belief. It needed enforcement. Ahnenerbe's first success was not a discovery. It was persuasion. It convinced educated men that ancestry was destiny, that cruelty could be justified by origin, that the past, if properly interpreted, could absolve any future act. When war finally came in September 1939, Ahnenerbe did not suspend its work. It intensified it. The search for ancient power accelerated alongside the advance of armies. The farther the Reich expanded, the more desperately it sought confirmation that expansion was inevitable. Germany was not invading Europe, its leaders claimed. It was returning to what had always been its own. And if history could be forced to agree, then the present would obey, no matter the cost. The creation of Ahnenerbe did not announce itself with ceremony or spectacle. There were no public speeches, no parades, no banners unfurled in Berlin's streets. Its birth was bureaucratic, almost forgettable. A memorandum signed, a department assigned, a budget quietly approved. That silence was intentional. Institutions meant to reshape reality do not begin with noise. They begin with paperwork. In the summer of 1935, the SS was in the midst of a transformation. What had once been a paramilitary guard was becoming a state within the state, autonomous, ideologically rigid, and answerable only to Adolf Hitler. At its head stood Heinrich Himmler, a man who viewed organization as a moral virtue and discipline as a form of belief. Himmler was not a charismatic speaker, nor a battlefield commander. His power came from structure, from files, from systems that outlived individuals. Ahnenerbe fit perfectly into that vision. Officially, the Institute was tasked with researching the intellectual history of the Germanic people. Unofficially, it was meant to supply the SS with something far more valuable than data: legitimacy. Not legal legitimacy, but historical inevitability. Proof, or at least the appearance of proof, that the SS represented not a political movement, but the natural culmination of thousands of years of racial evolution. This was not an abstract ambition. Himmler believed that the future of the SS depended on its ability to become something more than an armed force. Armies could be defeated, parties could collapse, but orders, especially those framed as ancient and sacred, endured. From the beginning, Ahnenerbe was designed as an ideological engine. Its early leadership reflected this purpose. Rather than appointing independent scholars, Himmler selected men who combined academic credentials with ideological reliability. The Institute's first president, Hermann Wirth, was a Dutch-German historian whose theories about prehistoric Nordic civilizations were widely criticized by mainstream scholars and deeply admired by Himmler. Wirth believed that ancient symbols found across Europe proved the existence of a lost northern culture that predated all known civilizations. Evidence was secondary. Interpretation was everything. That approach defined Ahnenerbe's methodology. Research questions were framed backward. Conclusions came first. Excavations were approved only if they promised to reinforce racial mythology. Linguistic studies were expected to demonstrate Germanic primacy. Anthropology focused obsessively on measurements, skulls, noses, bone structure, as if identity could be reduced to centimeters and angles. To modern eyes, this appears grotesque. To its architects, it felt necessary. Germany, in the mid-1930s, was obsessed with renewal. The humiliation of Versailles still lingered. Economic recovery had restored confidence, but not certainty. The regime needed a narrative that extended beyond politics, beyond grievance. It needed a story in which German dominance was not temporary, but eternal. Ahnenerbe promised exactly that. By 1936, the Institute was expanding rapidly. New departments were added: archaeology, folklore, runology, ancient astronomy. Grants flowed through SS channels, bypassing civilian oversight. Researchers were given access to restricted sites and protected archives. What could not be proven scientifically could be asserted symbolically. What could not be asserted could be implied. The distinction between evidence and belief blurred. Inside the SS, Ahnenerbe's work was treated with growing seriousness. Reports circulated describing ancient Germanic priesthoods, lost northern capitals, and advanced prehistoric knowledge erased by Christianity and Roman influence. These ideas were not debated on their merits. They were evaluated on their usefulness. Himmler, who despised Christianity as a foreign imposition, saw in these theories an opportunity to replace it. The SS was to become a new order, disciplined, ascetic, bound not by faith in salvation, but by loyalty to blood and soil. Ahnenerbe would provide the mythic foundation for that transformation. Nowhere was this more visible than in Himmler's plans for Wewelsburg Castle. Though still under renovation in the mid-1930s, the site already held symbolic significance. It was not intended as a military headquarters. It was intended as a center, ideological, spiritual, historical, a place where the SS could imagine itself as the heir to an ancient lineage of warrior priests. Ahnenerbe's research fed directly into this vision. Symbols recovered or invented by the Institute appeared in SS iconography. Rituals were adapted from reconstructed pagan ceremonies. Even the calendar was reimagined, emphasizing solstices and seasonal cycles over Christian holidays. This was not nostalgia. It was preparation. By reframing the SS as the modern expression of an ancient order, Himmler insulated it from moral critique. If the SS was not a product of the 20th century, then it could not be judged by 20th century ethics. Violence became ritual. Obedience became destiny. Within Ahnenerbe itself, dissent was rare and dangerous. Scholars who questioned the Institute's assumptions found their projects defunded or reassigned. Others adapted. Some convinced themselves that compromise was temporary, that they could preserve real scholarship within the system. Many simply embraced the mythology. Belief, after all, was rewarded. The most unsettling aspect of Ahnenerbe's early years was not its extremism, but its normalcy. Meetings followed agendas. Minutes were recorded. Research proposals were peer-reviewed by ideologues rather than scientists, but reviewed nonetheless. Invoices were paid. Progress reports submitted. Atrocities had not yet entered the equation. The institute was laying groundwork, not executing conclusions. But groundwork matters. By 1937, Ahnenerbe had ceased to resemble an academic society. It was a component of SS strategy. Its findings shaped training materials. Its language influenced speeches. Its assumptions seeped into policy. The idea that Germany was reclaiming a stolen past, rather than inventing a future, became embedded in the SS worldview. This shift had consequences. If history was a cycle, then destruction was merely renewal. If civilization had fallen once before, then rebuilding required removal. If decline was caused by mixing and weakness, then purity demanded force. These ideas did not originate in Ahnenerbe, but Ahnenerbe gave them structure, vocabulary, apparent legitimacy. It transformed myth into administration. As Europe moved closer to war, the Institute's role grew more ambitious. Archaeology alone was no longer sufficient. Proof would have to be found beyond Germany's borders. If the Aryan past was truly global, then evidence must exist elsewhere, in remote regions untouched by modern scrutiny. Plans were already forming. By the end of 1937, Ahnenerbe's leadership was preparing for expeditions that would carry SS researchers far beyond Europe, into mountains, into myth, into places where history blurred into legend. The search for ancient power was no longer theoretical. It was about to leave the archives and enter the world. By 1936, the work of Ahnenerbe had moved decisively out of offices and into the ground. Archaeology offered something uniquely useful to the SS: objects, stones, graves, weapons, things that could be photographed, displayed, and cited as evidence. Unlike philosophy or mythology, an artifact could be held in the hand. It could be pointed to. It could be framed as proof. And proof was what the Reich demanded. Across Germany and newly aligned territories, Ahnenerbe-sponsored teams began systematic excavations of prehistoric sites. Burial mounds, ancient settlements, ceremonial grounds, any location that could plausibly be linked to early Germanic presence became a target. The official goal was to reconstruct the everyday life of ancient ancestors. The real objective was far narrower: to demonstrate uninterrupted racial continuity and cultural superiority. Every dig began with an assumption: the ancestors were Germanic. The culture was advanced. The influence was expansive. If the soil cooperated, the results were celebrated. If it did not, the interpretation changed. Archaeology, under Ahnenerbe's direction, ceased to be an empirical discipline. It became ideological cartography. Each site was evaluated not on what it revealed, but on how effectively it could be integrated into a larger myth, one in which Germany was not a nation-state formed in the 19th century, but the surviving core of an ancient world civilization. Reports from the period show a consistent pattern. Ambiguous findings were described in confident language. Ordinary tools were elevated into symbols of technological brilliance. Coincidences between distant cultures were framed as evidence of migration rather than parallel development. The possibility that non-Germanic peoples had created or influenced these sites was systematically minimized or erased. Silence became a form of editing. Within Ahnenerbe's internal reviews, researchers were praised not for accuracy, but for ideological alignment. Excavations that failed to support the narrative found their funding quietly withdrawn. Scholars who raised methodological concerns were reassigned or sidelined. Some adapted by learning how to phrase uncertainty as inevitability. Others embraced the new rules entirely. The past, once contested, was being standardized. One of the Institute's most ambitious projects involved redefining the geographic scope of ancient Germanic influence. Traditional academic boundaries were inconvenient. If Germanic ancestors were truly the originators of civilization, then their presence had to extend far beyond modern Germany. Scandinavia, Eastern Europe, the Balkans, all were reframed as ancestral zones, rather than neighboring cultures. Maps were redrawn accordingly. These were not neutral exercises. Ahnenerbe's archaeological claims aligned neatly with the regime's territorial ambitions. If a region could be shown to have once been Germanic, then its contemporary population became a temporary anomaly, an interruption of history rather than its continuation. Excavation became rehearsal. The Institute's language grew increasingly confident as its work progressed. Early reports hedged their claims. By 1937, certainty replaced caution. Sites were no longer described as possibly Germanic, but as clearly ancestral. Disputed interpretations were presented as settled fact. Academic debate, when mentioned at all, was framed as foreign resistance to German truth. This rhetorical shift mattered. It allowed ideology to move seamlessly from research to policy. Archaeological conclusions appeared in SS training materials. Symbols identified or invented by Ahnenerbe were incorporated into insignia and ceremony. The past was not merely being studied, it was being deployed. At the center of this effort stood Heinrich Himmler, who followed Ahnenerbe's progress closely. He read reports personally, annotated margins, and intervened when findings did not align with expectations. To Himmler, archaeology was not about curiosity. It was about discipline. A disciplined past produced a disciplined future. Christian influence, in particular, was treated as contamination. Churches built atop older sites were framed as acts of cultural theft. Roman ruins were described as superficial overlays imposed upon deeper Germanic foundations. The narrative was clear. True civilization in Europe predated Christianity, and Germany was its rightful heir. This framing carried an implicit accusation. If Germanic culture was ancient and pure, then everything that followed was decay. The logic was simple and lethal. By reducing history to a struggle between purity and degeneration, Ahnenerbe transformed complexity into threat. Diversity became dilution. Exchange became corruption. Coexistence became weakness. Archaeology provided the language to make these ideas sound inevitable rather than chosen. Behind the scenes, some researchers understood what was happening. Private letters and post-war testimonies reveal unease, doubt, even fear. But the structure of the Institute rewarded compliance. Careers advanced, access expanded, silence became survival, and the ground kept yielding artifacts. Each object recovered was stripped of ambiguity and inserted into a single story, one that led inexorably toward confrontation. The more the past was simplified, the easier it became to weaponize. History, once flattened, could be marched forward like an army. By 1938, Ahnenerbe's leadership recognized the limits of European archaeology. The evidence they sought could only be stretched so far before contradiction became visible. If their narrative was to remain credible, it required something more dramatic, something that transcended Europe altogether. If ancient Aryans had once ruled the world, then their traces had to exist in places untouched by Western scholarship, in remote regions where myth still lived alongside history, where absence of data could be mistaken for mystery. The solution lay eastward, beyond familiar borders, beyond academic scrutiny, beyond easy refutation. Plans were drawn, funding approved, permission secured. The next phase of the search would not involve digging in familiar soil. It would involve leaving Europe entirely, and it would carry Ahnenerbe to the edge of legend. By 1938, the leadership of Ahnenerbe had reached an uncomfortable conclusion. Europe alone could no longer sustain the myth they were constructing. Too much had already been excavated. Too many contradictions were emerging. Too many scholars, even within Germany, quietly recognized the limits of interpretation. If the ancient Aryan past was truly global, then its most powerful traces would not lie in familiar soil. They would be found in places untouched by Western skepticism, in regions where legend still blended seamlessly with history, in landscapes vast enough to absorb speculation without immediate refutation. The answer, in the minds of Ahnenerbe planners, lay in Tibet. To the SS imagination, Tibet was not simply a geographic destination. It was a symbol, remote, isolated, mythologized for centuries in European esoteric literature as the possible home of Shambhala, a hidden center of ancient wisdom. If there existed a place where fragments of primordial knowledge had survived untouched, it had to be there. The expedition was approved in early 1938 and placed under the leadership of Ernst Schaefer, a young but experienced zoologist who had previously traveled through Asia. Schaefer was not a mystic. He was pragmatic, ambitious, and keenly aware that his career now depended on SS patronage. That made him useful. Officially, the mission was scientific. It would study flora, fauna, geography, and culture. Unofficially, its objectives were far more ideological. To search for evidence of ancient Aryan migration into Central Asia, to measure physical characteristics of the local population, and to locate symbols, myths, or structures that could be interpreted as remnants of a lost northern civilization. In April 1938, the team departed Germany. By the time they reached Tibet in 1939, Europe stood on the brink of war. The expedition carried more than cameras and notebooks. It carried calipers for measuring skulls, instruments for recording facial angles, charts designed to classify human beings into racial categories. Anthropology, stripped of ethics, had become a forensic tool for ideology. Local authorities, wary but curious, permitted limited access. Tibetan monks were photographed, villages documented, rituals observed, often misunderstood, sometimes deliberately misrepresented. Objects of religious significance were catalogued, not for their meaning, but for their resemblance to symbols Ahnenerbe researchers already believed were Aryan in origin. Every coincidence was magnified. Every difference was minimized. When Tibetan legends spoke of ancient teachers arriving from the north, the expedition recorded it as migration. When symbols resembled those found in Europe, spirals, suns, geometric forms, they were framed as proof of shared ancestry, rather than universal human expression. Absence of evidence was not a problem. It was an invitation. Reports sent back to Berlin were carefully worded. They avoided explicit claims of discovery while implying significance just beyond reach. Language mattered. Phrases like suggestive parallels and remarkable correspondences appeared repeatedly. Enough to excite interest, not enough to invite scrutiny. Behind the scientific tone lay a deeper certainty. The expedition did not need to find ancient power. It needed to confirm belief. By the time the team returned to Germany in August 1939, weeks before the invasion of Poland, its practical results were modest. No lost civilization, no ancient texts, no artifacts that could not be explained through conventional history. But that hardly mattered. What Ahnenerbe gained from Tibet was something more valuable than proof: permission. The absence of definitive evidence was reframed as evidence of deliberate concealment. The idea that ancient knowledge had been hidden, protected, guarded, erased by hostile forces, fit perfectly into SS ideology. It explained why proof was elusive. It justified further action. It reinforced the belief that Germany alone was destined to uncover what others could not. Internally, the expedition was declared a success. Photographs circulated through SS offices. Measurements were archived. Cultural observations were selectively cited. Tibet entered the Ahnenerbe mythos as a distant echo of Aryan antiquity. Incomplete, corrupted, but recognizably related. And with that, the search for ancient power crossed a threshold. No longer confined to Europe, no longer restrained by academic caution, no longer satisfied with interpretation alone. The past had proven malleable enough to support any conclusion, provided one looked far enough away. As war engulfed the continent, Ahnenerbe's work did not slow. It hardened. The next phase would no longer focus on ruins or legends. It would turn inward, toward the human body itself. Because if ancient superiority could not be found intact in the world, Then, it would have to be measured, tested, and extracted from living flesh. When war began in September 1939, the transformation of Ahnenerbe was not sudden. It was logical. For 4 years, the Institute had trained itself to treat history as raw material and people as evidence. It had learned how to ignore contradiction, how to convert belief into administrative language, how to present ideology as research. By the time Europe descended into full-scale violence, Ahnenerbe no longer needed ruins or legends. It had something more accessible: human bodies. The shift did not require a formal declaration. There was no moment when archaeology officially ended and experimentation began. The transition happened quietly, through memoranda, approvals, and the gradual expansion of authority. War removed constraints that had once limited what could be done in the name of research. Camps, initially conceived as tools of repression and control, became laboratories. For Himmler, this was not a deviation from purpose. It was fulfillment. If ancient superiority could not be conclusively proven through artifacts, then it would be demonstrated biologically. The human body would reveal what history refused to confirm. Within the SS, this reasoning felt consistent. If race determined destiny, then race had to be measurable. Endurance, resistance to cold, tolerance of pain, survivability under extreme conditions. These were no longer moral questions. They were data points. By 1940, Ahnenerbe had established direct involvement in a series of medical and physiological experiments conducted within concentration camps, most notably Dachau concentration camp. The choice of Dachau was not accidental. It was close to Munich, easily accessible, and already deeply embedded within the SS system. Oversight was minimal. Prisoners were plentiful. Secrecy was absolute. Officially, many experiments were justified as military necessity. Luftwaffe pilots needed to survive high altitudes. Soldiers needed to endure freezing temperatures. Submarine crews needed to withstand pressure and oxygen deprivation. These rationalizations were repeated endlessly in reports. But the scope of experimentation went far beyond pragmatic defense. Subjects were submerged in ice water to determine how long a human could survive hypothermia. Others were exposed to simulated high-altitude conditions until they lost consciousness or died. Recovery methods were tested not to save lives, but to observe failure. Ahnenerbe physicians recorded pulse rates, reflexes, and time to death with meticulous care. Charts were drawn, conclusions were summarized, bodies were disposed of. The language used in documentation was sterile. Subjects were referred to as material. Deaths were outcomes. Pain was implied, never described. In this vocabulary, murder became procedure. What distinguished Ahnenerbe's involvement from other SS medical crimes was its ideological framing. These experiments were not only about military efficiency, they were about hierarchy. If German bodies were to rule, then other bodies existed to be consumed by knowledge. Prisoners selected for experimentation were rarely random. Jews, Roma, Soviet POWs, and other groups deemed racially inferior were disproportionately targeted. Their suffering was rationalized as inevitable, even useful. If they were destined to disappear, the logic went, then their final contribution could be scientific. This was not madness. It was consistency. As the war expanded eastward, Ahnenerbe's reach expanded with it. The invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 produced millions of captives and unprecedented access to populations outside the Reich's borders. Camps multiplied. Conditions worsened. Opportunities increased. Human experimentation became more varied and more extreme. Physicians affiliated with Ahnenerbe conducted studies on bone regeneration, infectious diseases, and trauma. In some cases, prisoners were deliberately injured to observe healing. In others, limbs were amputated, organs removed, or diseases introduced. Consent was never sought. Survival was rarely expected. Each experiment was framed as a contribution to knowledge. Each death was filed away. What made these crimes possible was not only cruelty, but distance. Ahnenerbe researchers rarely viewed their subjects as individuals. They were representatives of categories: racial, political, biological. Once reduced to abstraction, suffering lost urgency. The camps provided a closed environment in which ethics could be suspended indefinitely. No witnesses, no appeals, no consequences. Reports flowed upward through SS channels, sanitized and summarized. Senior officials, including Himmler, received briefings that emphasized results rather than methods. There is no evidence that Himmler objected. On the contrary, he intervened when experiments were delayed or insufficiently ambitious. He demanded clarity, efficiency, and applicability. The body, in his worldview, was a site of truth. If properly tested, it would reveal immutable laws of nature, laws that justified domination. As Germany's military position deteriorated after 1943, the experiments did not cease. They intensified. Defeat did not weaken belief, it sharpened it. The more reality contradicted ideology, the more desperately the SS clung to biological explanations. Failures on the battlefield were attributed to insufficient purity, insufficient hardness, insufficient elimination of weakness. Research continued under increasingly chaotic conditions, often without meaningful oversight. Some physicians began to recognize the approaching collapse. Others doubled down, convinced that their work would outlive the Reich itself. Knowledge, they believed, was neutral. It could be preserved, transferred, reused. They were wrong. By 1944, Allied forces were uncovering fragments of the system Ahnenerbe had helped build. Liberated camps revealed evidence that could not be erased by destroyed files or burned archives. Survivors spoke of experiments that defied comprehension. Bodies bore marks that contradicted every claim of scientific purpose. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, the machinery stopped abruptly. Camps were liberated. SS personnel fled or were captured. Ahnenerbe, as an institution, ceased to exist almost overnight. But accountability was uneven. At the Nuremberg doctors' trial, 1946-1947, some physicians were prosecuted and executed. Others received prison sentences. Many escaped serious punishment entirely, shielded by incomplete records or the emerging priorities of the Cold War. Ahnenerbe itself was declared a criminal organization, but its members dispersed into civilian life with varying degrees of scrutiny. The myth collapsed faster than its consequences. What remained was evidence, not of ancient power, but of how easily belief can turn methodical cruelty into routine work. Ahnenerbe did not invent dehumanization. It professionalized it. It gave it language, structure, and institutional protection. In the end, the Institute failed to prove what it set out to demonstrate. There was no lost civilization, no biological destiny, no ancient mandate. But it succeeded in something far more dangerous. It proved that once myth is accepted as fact, any crime can be reframed as research. And once research is severed from ethics, knowledge itself becomes lethal. The end did not come with revelation. It came with noise. By early 1945, the world Ahnenerbe had helped construct was collapsing under artillery fire, aerial bombardment, and logistical failure. Allied armies advanced from the west and east, tearing through the infrastructure that had allowed ideology to masquerade as inevitability. Camps were abandoned. Archives were burned. Trains ran without schedules. Orders contradicted one another. The SS, once obsessed with control, began to improvise. For Ahnenerbe, collapse was not philosophical. It was administrative. Files disappeared first. In the final months of the war, trucks loaded with documents were driven into forests, lakes, and rivers. Records were burned in courtyards and basements. Some were buried. Others were destroyed hastily, leaving fragments behind, charred pages, half-legible charts, incomplete lists of names. The intention was clear. If the evidence vanished, responsibility could follow. Many researchers fled before the Reich formally surrendered. Some abandoned their SS uniforms and resumed civilian identities almost immediately. Others were captured and questioned. A few committed suicide, convinced that history would never understand their work. They were wrong about that. What history struggled with was the scale of silence. When Allied forces liberated the camps in April and May 1945, they encountered horrors that defied language. Survivors spoke of experiments, of selections, of doctors who measured pain with stopwatches. Corpses bore marks that contradicted any claim of medical necessity. The physical evidence was undeniable. But Ahnenerbe, as an institution, remained curiously elusive. Unlike the Gestapo or the SS as a whole, it left no single headquarters filled with intact records. Its work had been dispersed across departments, camps, universities, and expeditions. Responsibility was diluted. Everyone had participated, but no one appeared central. This fragmentation was not accidental. It was the final success of the system. In 1946, during preparations for the Nuremberg doctors' trial, investigators attempted to reconstruct the role of Ahnenerbe in human experimentation. The process was slow and incomplete. Witnesses contradicted one another. Documents referenced projects without naming personnel. Some physicians claimed they had acted independently. Others insisted they were following orders. Many invoked ignorance. Ignorance became the most common defense. Several doctors directly affiliated with SS research were convicted and executed. Others received prison sentences. But a significant number escaped with light punishment, or none at all. By the late 1940s, geopolitical priorities shifted. The Cold War began to reshape alliances. Scientific expertise, even tainted expertise, became valuable. Silence proved adaptable. Former Ahnenerbe researchers reappeared in universities, laboratories, and research institutes across post-war Germany and beyond. Some changed names. Others emphasized unrelated publications. A few openly framed themselves as victims of ideological pressure. Their pasts were inconvenient and often overlooked. The institute itself was dissolved without ceremony. There was no formal reckoning, no public inquiry dedicated solely to its crimes. Ahnenerbe became a footnote, a curiosity, a shadow within a larger narrative of SS atrocities. That, too, was convenient. Because confronting Ahnenerbe meant confronting something deeply unsettling, that the crimes of the Third Reich were not committed only by fanatics and sadists, but by educated professionals who believed they were doing meaningful work. The post-war world preferred clearer villains. In the 1950s, as West Germany rebuilt, the language surrounding Ahnenerbe softened. It was described as misguided, pseudoscientific, delusional. These words implied error rather than intent. They suggested failure rather than responsibility. But Ahnenerbe did not fail. It accomplished exactly what it was designed to do. It provided an ideological bridge between myth and murder. It transformed belief into procedure. It allowed violence to be administered calmly, methodically, and with institutional approval. It proved that once ethics are subordinated to destiny, any act can be justified as necessity. The most enduring damage was not physical, it was conceptual. By framing domination as restoration and cruelty as correction, Ahnenerbe demonstrated how easily the past can be weaponized. History, when stripped of complexity, becomes a tool. Myth, when institutionalized, becomes policy. Science, when detached from ethics, becomes lethal. These lessons did not disappear in 1945. They receded. Ahnenerbe's ideas did not survive intact, but fragments lingered. In fringe racial theories, in nationalist mythology, in the persistent temptation to explain inequality through origin rather than choice. The language changed. The assumptions endured. What made Ahnenerbe uniquely dangerous was not its fascination with the ancient world. It was its certainty. The certainty that identity is inherited. The certainty that hierarchy is natural. The certainty that suffering can be rationalized through history. In the end, no ancient power was uncovered. No lost civilization emerged from the mountains or the soil. The past refused to cooperate. But something else was revealed. That the greatest horror of Ahnenerbe was not what it believed, but how efficiently it translated belief into action. The institute collapsed quietly. Its members dispersed. Its archives vanished into ash and water. Its logic did not. And that, perhaps, is the most unsettling legacy of all. When the doors closed behind Ahnenerbe, there was no sound. No announcement marked its end. No ceremony acknowledged its crimes. No single moment signaled that the danger had passed. Institutions like Ahnenerbe do not collapse the way regimes do. They dissolve. They thin out. They scatter into careers, libraries, footnotes, and half-forgotten biographies. Their language fades first. Their logic survives longer. By the early 1950s, Ahnenerbe existed mostly as a rumor, an uncomfortable curiosity from the margins of Nazi history. It appeared occasionally in trial transcripts, in academic debates about pseudoscience, in sensationalist articles that emphasized its occult aspects. This framing was reassuring. It suggested absurdity, irrationality, madness. But that interpretation missed the point. Ahnenerbe was not dangerous because it was mystical. It was dangerous because it was administrative. It did not demand faith in miracles. It demanded trust in procedure. Its researchers did not claim divine visions. They submitted reports. That distinction matters, because the most enduring threat Ahnenerbe represents is not its obsession with ancient power, but its demonstration of how easily knowledge can be bent into permission. Permission to dominate, permission to exclude, permission to destroy. The Institute did not invent racism, nationalism, or historical myth. Those existed long before 1935. What Ahnenerbe provided was infrastructure, a system in which belief could be funded, staffed, protected, and normalized. Once belief becomes routine, it no longer feels like belief at all. It feels like work. That is why the end of the Third Reich did not automatically end the danger. The collapse of a regime does not erase the intellectual shortcuts it relied upon. It does not undo the habit of explaining violence through destiny or inequality through origin. Ahnenerbe's central claim, that history confers authority, is older than Nazism and far more durable. It appears whenever ancestry is treated as entitlement, whenever complexity is flattened into hierarchy, whenever the past is invoked not to understand, but to justify. The Institute's scholars believed they were uncovering truth buried by time. In reality, they were manufacturing certainty where none existed. The ancient world, fragmented and ambiguous, offered endless space for projection. Into that space they poured ideology, and then declared it discovery. This mechanism has not disappeared. It resurfaces whenever pseudoscience borrows the language of research, whenever selective evidence is presented as inevitability, whenever heritage becomes a weapon rather than a memory. Ahnenerbe matters because it reveals a pattern. First, history is simplified. Then it is moralized. Then it is weaponized. And finally, violence is reframed as necessity. The Institute's failure to uncover ancient power did not prevent it from shaping modern catastrophe. It proved that belief does not need to be true to be lethal. It only needs to be institutionalized. The past, after all, cannot defend itself. It cannot object when its fragments are misused. It cannot correct those who speak in its name. It can only be interpreted, honestly or otherwise. That is the final danger Ahnenerbe leaves behind. Not that people will search for lost civilizations or ancient secrets, but that they will search for authorization in history and accept the answer they want to hear. In the ruins of the Reich, the world learned many lessons about war, ideology, and power. But one lesson remains easily forgotten, that cruelty does not always announce itself as hatred. Sometimes, it arrives dressed as research. Sometimes, it speaks the language of scholarship. Sometimes, it insists it is only restoring what was always meant to be. Ahnenerbe did not summon ancient gods. It summoned something far more real, a system in which myth replaced conscience, and knowledge learned how to kill. And that is why its story does not end in 1945.